few years later. And then I'm going to interpret that, well, with the help of the second half of the chapter, which was the interpretation given by the angel Gabriel. So, chapter 8, verse 1. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision, after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged towards the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came towards the 2-horned ram I had been standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it. The goat knocked it to the ground and trampled on it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. Out of one of them came another horn, which started small but grew in power to the south and to the east and towards the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did. The truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled?" The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Gripping stuff. Now, it's sort of fantastical, really. The beasts are familiar characters in this case. The previous set of beasts bore no real correlation with these, other than what the powers that they possessed. It's sort of something like, I can imagine you coming up with, Naomi, in one of your fantastical short stories. But clearly, Daniel saw this in a vision. Unlike the chapter before, which was in a dream, it was a kind of an outer bodily experience, and he pictured himself quite clearly in the city of Susa, in the province of Elam, by the Ulai Canal. Very similar setting to that of Ezekiel, and a lot of the imagery that we see in Daniel is similar to that of Ezekiel, who were contemporaries. I like this chapter because actually, in retrospect, we can look back at the way that history unfolded, and we can very clearly pin what happened in the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires to some specifics of that vision. So let's just recap. The whole of this book of Daniel that we've been covering has taught us 3 things, really. Number 1, God is in control. He's powerful and he's in control in a time of difficulty. Number 2, that time of difficulty was that of exile for God's people. But we can draw massive encouragement from it, because we are in fact exiles. From the beginning of our lives to the end, we are in fact living as exiles outside of the true culture and kingdom that we need to be a part. It says in Philippians 3:20 that we are citizens of heaven. So we're just in this other kingdom for a time. And then thirdly, it teaches us how to live in exile, how we can cope with the fact that there are other powers in power. How do we operate in that situation? So, summarising what John brought us last week, those beasts that he described so well are 4 kingdoms. And those kingdoms, there are 2 interpretations, but they pretty much amount to the same thing. But I'm going to give you what I think the pictures are of. Now, there's no real doubt that the first kingdom is that of Babylon. And there's no doubt because actually it's the kingdom that they were living in at the time. So some of this had actually come to pass. And Babylon was responsible for people of God going into exile. The second kingdom was the Mede-Persian Empire. Now, if you separate these out, then you get a different number, in which case you get a slightly different interpretation. But the Mede-Persian Empire is the ram that we get in chapter 8. Okay? And eventually, in the Persian end of the empire, it is what sent them out of exile back to the homeland. But there was a third empire which was going to rise, and with rapid speed. Now, in chapter 7, this is the beast that is the leopard, representing lightning quick speed. And in the passage that we've just heard, it's the ram, and the ram moves north, east, and west. It's incredibly quick and incredibly powerful. And that is that of the Greek Empire, which, of course, if you've done any school history, is a very significant world empire. And then, if you combine the Mede and Persian Empire, you also get the Roman Empire, which, again, we know to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest civilization, that we, even in Britain, still, continue with the remains of the effects of that Greek and Roman Empire. And the Greek Empire was known for many things, but I'm kind of broadly summarizing. But they tended to Hellenize places, so they brought their culture. So rather than seeking to dominate with just army and rule, they would Hellenize places, so seeking to make them more Greek-like. They wouldn't have to kind of rule over them continuously, because they would just become another province of Greece. They did that through their culture, did that through their language, and did it also through their philosophy or their learning. And much of our culture still underpinned by Greek philosophy and the ideas that they came up. For example, the atom. We all know about the atom. Well, the Greeks thought about and came up with the atom way before modern science, and then we kind of forgot about it for the best part of 2,000 years and then rediscovered it. So the Greeks were ahead of their time in thinking and culture. The Romans did it slightly different way. If you've ever heard of the Pax Romana, they did it by bringing, peace in inverted commas, is what the Pax Romana means. Well, it was peaceful once they've kind of subjugated the world and had things their way. And they did that through a mighty army and law and order. And to facilitate that, they did that through a massive network of roads and great buildings, architecture, sanitation. I always love that scene, and it's one of the best Monty Python scripts of all time, What have the Romans ever done for us? Well, actually quite a lot when you go through the list. So for all their ills of these empires, actually they were great civilizations. You can't build an empire without being highly organized, highly civilized, but also, as we can see in this passage, highly powerful. And it's this Greek empire that kind of gets the highlight in Daniel chapter 8, because we read that even though there's this mighty ram with 2 horns, the second of which grew to be larger and longer, that being the Persian horn, because the Persian bit came later and was more powerful, that is then smashed to pieces by a goat. And the goat with a single horn is that of the Greek Empire. And horn is often in ancient literature as a symbol of power or kingship. And so this horn is Alexander the Great. And he truly was great because his empire spread massively and quickly. By the age of 33, Alexander the Great's empire spanned from Italy all the way to India. It was huge, and just totally dominated the area, including the beautiful land, i.e. Palestine. Now, he died aged 33. And just like that, this great power was removed of its power because he died. All men are like grass, it says. And kingdoms flourish and kingdoms fall. His 2 sons were then murdered in a power grab by 4 of his generals. So the thinking is that those 4 generals represented the 4 horns that we then hear of. And those 4 horns divided up the empire. And later, one of those rulers came up and was more ruthless and more powerful, quite un-Greek actually, because he did away with the kind of idea of assimilating the cultural element, and he is the one who is mentioned as suddenly causing the desolation and desecration of the temple and removing the temple sacrifices. And that is the man Antiochus IV. Now, it's worth writing his name down because you can almost see the word Antichrist in that. And he was an Antichrist figure. So much as you can pin it on individual people. Antiochus IV. Now, huge irony here. He founded Antioch, from which the beginnings of Christianity, totally began, the kingdom of God spreading across the world. But Antiochus, he called himself Epiphanes, self-titled. Okay, my advice to you is never call yourself Epiphanes. You can have an epiphany, but don't call yourself Epiphanes, because it means God manifest. And so incredible that they can actually use that. He can use that phrase when we know that Daniel has received knowledge from the angel Gabriel that, in fact, it says he's going to set himself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. Well, calling yourself God manifest is pretty much doing that, isn't it? Okay, and in the interpretation as well, it says he sets himself up to be superior and will make a stand against the prince of princes. That's another word for God. Okay, now his opposition loved to take the mickey of him, because you can imagine him being a bit of a tyrant. So they called him Epiphanes, or I'm going to get it right. Epimanes, get it right, Holloway. Epimanes, which means mad one. But how many little dictators do we know that are actually, mad, but power grabbing and scary? And it's him who starts small, political machinations lead him to rise to power. He has success in Egypt, Persia, Parthia, Armenia, and Palestine. And he then, in 167 BC, desecrates the temple. He sets up a statue to the god, the Greek god Zeus. They were polytheists, and they had Zeus as number one, and they stuck a pig as a pig's head in honor of their god Zeus in the temple, and they stopped all temple worship. Can you imagine what that did to God's people? They no longer had this way of accessing the Holy of Holies. They had no way of making sacrifice for their sins to Yahweh. So it was calamitous in the extreme for the people of Israel. And we get this number, 2,300 days. Strange that we should have this number. No, and it's very hard to work out whether that was a literal or symbolic number. It was no use to Daniel because this is now into the future, 200 years. So there was no way in which they can actually use this prophecy to control the circumstances. But then, just as the prophecy said, he was taken away. His horn was shattered. He died, some say of battle wounds, some say he fell off his chariot. Could have been a combination of the both, of course. And the stench of his rotting flesh meant that even his closest advisors didn't want to come near him. So he came to a pitiful end, just like all kingdoms will end. So, bet you're thinking, great history lesson, Giles, but what is the point of that? Why is God coming to Daniel in his point of great need in exile and kind of revealing ancient history in the future? Well, I just want to share with you just a few reasons, because I think, there's a lot of prophecy in the Bible. We might as well have an idea of what it's there for. So, first of all, Daniel was in a traumatic present. And in that traumatic present, we often hold out for other things, don't we? If I've got a really hard week at work ahead of me, when my head hits the pillow, I either think back to those wonderful memories of childhood when I was carefree, or I project forward to the future when I'm going to play my next round of golf or the next sunny activity I'm going to do, yeah? So actually, in our traumatic present, it's actually very helpful to think back to the past. I'm going to call it comforting past, because our God is a comfort, and he did that to his people Israel. Most of the history of Israel was kind of written down and reflected on and shaped by their years in exile. Why is that? Because they were thinking back, well, the last time we were occupied by a foreign force in Egypt, who was it who got us out of Egypt? It was God. There was no great battle. There was no great powerful uprising from the Israelites. God got them out. So drawing on those stories of the past was comforting. Second, having prophetic unction gives us a hopeful future. And that's what the prophetic does. And it does it I've got at least 4 ways. It encourages us. The prophetic gives us encouragement. Because it says, you're not in this alone. God is in control. He will sort the future. We win in the end. God will do it. That's hugely encouraging. It's also encouraging if you get the angel of Gabriel come and sit next to you and reveal these things to you. Anybody had that? No? But I still have encouragement from anybody, God's angels, God's people, who come up to me with a prophetic word. Yeah? So let's encourage one another with prophecy. Second of all, it reveals our context, because Daniel might have been feeling like he's in an oppressed place. But when you actually extrapolate out and you think, oh my goodness, actually we've got it good with the Babylonians. You know, King Nebuchadnezzar actually repented in the end, and he's sitting at the king's table. So actually, what's coming in the face of the Roman and the Greek Empire means that actually we're okay. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, there's always a battle going on. There's always a war between mankind and power grabbing. So the context is that of battle. And if we see that actually life is a battle, then we can come to terms with our own circumstance, and we can accept it, and we can flourish in it. Third thing, it brings great hope. When we know that God wins in the end, that brings hope for the now. And you notice that a lot of these prophecies, there is a time-bound element. Not one that can help us sit down and work out when Armageddon's going to happen, but one in which it reassures us that God has a time plan. Not even Jesus knows that time plan, but God, the Father, knows when it's going to take place. So just that knowledge itself gives us hope. And fourthly, reassurance. Because for Daniel, this is in the future. For us, these prophecies have come true, and they're there for all to see. We can reflect on history and see that God was true to his word. That is reassurance to us. So although it's prophecy, it's also an example of God's greatness, an example of God being in control. Okay, so that's all very well, Giles. Thanks for that. But how is that going to apply to my life? What is Daniel saying to us, for us today? Well, if we just draw on a couple of other scriptures, let's just reflect for a moment. Isaiah 40, verse 8 says, "The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of God stands forever." Remember that phrase. The word of God stands forever. He is the rock. Matthew 24, when Jesus was talking about the end times, he said, "Nations will rise against nation, kingdoms against kingdom, but my word will never pass away." Jesus, the rock, the word, is not going anywhere. His kingdom will increase and last forever. So we can sing that will be here for thousands of years, because we will. And we do not need to worry. And Galatians 4, verse 4 says this: "When we were children, we were in slavery under the basic principles of the world. But when the time had fully come, God sent his Son." Just think about that. God knew that there was going to be the Babylonians, the Mede-Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. But you can actually look at all those empires, for all their good and all their ill, and you can say, well, actually, God chose this moment to reveal his Son, because it was a time of unprecedented stability and travel opportunity across the entire known world, that of the Mediterranean. It was just the right time where Greek culture and language united the world, and it allowed for the spread of the gospel. And the philosophy behind all that was the kind of the operating system around which all the great fathers of the faith were able to interpret the gospel into culture. So God knows what he's doing. So we need to read into that what's happening now, and we'll touch upon this more next week. But what's happening now with the internet, with the kind of the military prowess of, say, the United States or the United Nations that has brought unprecedented stability and lack of war and commotion in our world. So we need to read the signs of the times, not so that we can, go for a big power grab, but so that we can understand our place and our opportunity to see the kingdom of God flourish. There are also 4 elements I just want to draw out of all empires, things that empires seek to do, whether they're physical empires like I've described this morning, or those of things like consumerism and capitalism and individualism. And they are this. So these are 4 themes of empire. First of all, they set themselves up to oppose God. Not always intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, but if they want to be top dog, they automatically oppose God because they take him out of the top spot where he belongs. The second thing, again, either intentionally or unintentionally, is that they oppress people. You can see it with consumerism and capitalism, for example. Perhaps they don't set out to do that, but in the markets around the world, we end up with almost, slavery by anything else other than name. There is oppression and inequality. The more power they get, the more opinionated they get, the more totalitarian they get. I don't know whether you've noticed that. There's a lot of fear at the moment. I can't spell when I'm talking. Of a kind of nanny state, of 24/7 cameras, etc., etc. And it's all in the name of making sure that we know that people are doing what they should be doing. People get fearful, don't they, when we have to give our details for vaccination. And to be honest, I trust the state for my medical care. It's absolutely brilliant for the NHS, but there is that background fear, and we see it played out in films, don't we, with the FBI, for example, or the KGB. That seeking to keep power means that you become more opinionated, you rule and reign, and often, this in Daniel chapter 8, it says that truth was thrown to the ground. Isn't that interesting? We are living more than perhaps ever in a post-truth society. And it's something about truth that is denied. And it says in the interpretation, it says deceit prospers. That can't be a good thing. And finally, number 4, at this stage, I was pretty hardwired into the OPs. When you've got a couple, you end up having to go for it, don't you? So this is a bit of a fudge. Opiates. Okay, what are you saying there, Giles? Well, what I'm saying is that empires seek to pacify. Once you've got your empire, you don't want an uprising. So you give them gladiators, you give them amphitheatres, you give them cinemas, you give them Netflix, you give them anything that's just going to give them pleasure, it's just going to keep them mildly happy, and it pacifies any resistance. I'm sure there are more. But it's easy for us to sit here and talk about them empires out there, evil as they are. But actually, this all resides in the heart of every one of us. Any empire comes together because of the heart of perhaps one great leader, but also the hearts of men and women around that leader. And it needs people, hearts to follow. And we are all capable of that same thing in our own little empire, whether it's in our home, in our house, in our work, We've all seen a tyrannical 2-year-old, haven't we? Trying to just entertain their little empire by demanding things and controlling their parents through their behaviour. So I want to suggest that let's not get too much on our high horse. If we look at our own lives, we are quite happy to oppose God when we seek to put ourselves higher than God, put ourselves first. We are quite capable of oppressing people, however subtly, however we might seek to manipulate them. We can become very opinionated in our views. There's that phrase, grumpy old men. You know, well, when we've perhaps passed our best and can't have power in the workplace anymore, it's quite easy to become an armchair opinionist, isn't it? And it's part of that desire to dominate people and shout and say, you got it wrong, mate. And we're very able to subscribe to pleasure and other things that will pacify us and keep us from God. And I think there's one solution which I would want to present to you as our finishing point today, which is that of what we've been saying all this morning and as Ange has led us, which is openness to God. We've got to open up our hearts and let him in back into his rightful place to avoid this. And in our situation, again, stuff that I'll go on to next week, if we're open to God, we can let him show us how to deal with empire and live righteously. So I'm going to just hand back to Ange now, and she's going to lead us in prayer and